Good morning, John.
Morning, Mark. How are you?
Very good, very good. I'm here in my. You're locked up in your office. I'm here in my house.
That's nice.
Drinking my coffee out of my special cup that has a picture of my daughter with the next mayor of Washington, Adrian Fenty. She got her picture taken with Adrian Fenty on primary day. Got it in the Washington Times, and we got a mug made out of it. So
you have me beat. I've got my C-SPAN cup.
Yeah.
So it's not as cute as yours.
That's probably true. My niece then decided to top it. She has pictures of herself because she lives in a swing district in Pennsylvania. She got a picture of herself with now Senator Casey. Right. We thought, okay, we got to top that. We got Fenty, she got Casey. We got to top that. We'll go for Hillary or something.
Yeah.
Then next thing we knew, she had a picture of herself with Bill Clinton. She's 6, so she's got 2 of these.
Wow,
pictures in the newspaper.
They got the swing district kids have it made.
They have it made. I know we are really. We're really not giving our daughter everything she's entitled to.
That's the 2 Americas, the privileged America
the 2 Americas.
that lives in the Rust Belt.
We
and
do
the
have
privileged America that lives in the elite cities in Washington and New York that never gets any candidates.
Right. Well, I'm eager to do this Blogging Heads because I feel like Blogging Heads has finally been put on the map this week, or earned the millions of dollars in foundation money that Bob raised for it with that recent episode with Ann Althouse and Jonah Goldberg. Did you watch that one?
I did. It was
quite an interesting show. I thought it raised a couple questions about blogging heads, and we won't spend too much time being self-referential here.
Okay.
But I thought it was interesting. I appeared once on Blogging Heads with Jonah, and we had a good time. It was fine. It was very amiable, and even though we have diametrically opposed political views, and I know Bob Wright thinks that that's a contribution to bringing peace in the world. I think it was just not as entertaining as it should be. Uh-huh. And meanwhile, you and I were on a couple weeks ago. We found a lot of things to disagree about. You have Jonah on with Ann Althouse, who I think is pretty conservative, although she styles herself a kind of ultra centrist. And they went crazy. They went nuts. So it's kind of like you definitely get more entertainment value, I think, when you have people who are closer in agreement. I think than when you have people whose basic political positions are far apart. That was one thing that was interesting about it. The other thing I thought was interesting about it, and you probably have much more substantive reactions to it. The other thing I thought was interesting about it was how Blogging Heads is almost like a reality show of. How sometimes when you're talking, I don't know if people realize we're basically just talking on the phone. We don't see each other. How sometimes when you're talking on the phone to somebody and they're driving you crazy, you have all kinds of facial gestures, and you might even give them the finger, and you might even give them the double finger. Even all the time you're being basically trying to be amiable on the phone, but you're using your privacy of your office or your house or whatever to go crazy. All of that was on display in Jonah's facial expressions and everything else. It was like a reality show of the other side of the phone conversation. I thought that was entertaining. But the substance of their disagreement was kind of interesting on a number of levels. One having to do with the role of libertarians and the role of race and states' rights. But just the intensity of the disagreement and the I don't know. I wound up being I think a little more sympathetic to Jonah's view that you go to a conference, you don't necessarily play factional politics.
Yeah, no, I think he was
on the issues. I'm
right
sure Ann Althouse is right. I mean, the conservatives do have to come to grips with the racism in their past.
Her expectation that he needs to be her ally and treat her as an ally and friend was a weird expectation for an intellectual.
Exactly.
But so for those who haven't seen it, they were talking about states' rights and libertarianism and the states' rights principle, and she was making the point that conservatives and libertarians need to be more proactive in recognizing that the fundamental application of states' rights in the 20th century was disastrous. It was in defense of Jim Crow. And Jonah's point was that, no, sure, it failed that one time, but it's a good principle and we should stick with it and we can talk about it as an abstraction. And Jonah's position really reminded me of the communists who want to talk about Marx and Marxism and Marx's ideas and sure, okay, we had some problems in the Soviet Union, but the idea still works. It's still a really good idea. The problem there are a lot of problems with states' rights, but one of them is, look, if it leads to things like Jim Crow, then it's not a good first principle of government. It might be like an okay secondary principle. But, that's exactly why states' rights isn't such a great idea. You have things like Jim Crow because states can do awful things. So,
Right.
Jonah's weird attempt to kind of bracket that and put it aside as if it has nothing to do with the actual principle of states' rights. Well, of course it does. I mean, because it leads to terrible real-world results, which is, a very good way to judge principles, I would say.
Right, right. Although at the same time, I felt that in the view which both of them I think held, that liberals have no respect at all for states, is wildly out of touch with the current times. I mean, there was a time in the 60s and 70s when liberalism was all about strong federal government. If you didn't have a strong federal government imposing solid standards, not just on racial equity, but on Medicaid and all kinds of things, you'd have people in Mississippi would be screwed, and you'd have that was the essence of liberalism. And I think since that time, over the decades, creakingly, there's much more of a recognition of the value and importance of states, and as laboratories, as the fact that states are actually closer to the services they're delivering to people, that there are significant differences in the economics and culture and structures of different states that allow for a huge play of experimentation, so that you have somebody like Senator Feingold. His approach to health care is give states incentives to experiment and find ways to solve this problem on their own. I just felt they were also having an argument that had a caricature of liberalism that was 40 years old.
Yeah. I mean, my view of the states' rights issue is that basically nobody, liberal or conservative, really cares about states' rights at all. I mean, you can't go 6 months without reading about conservatives trying to run roughshod over some, state initiative that's not to their liking.
That's right.
Basically, everyone venue shops for the
Right.
venue. And generally, states tend to be more friendly to the conservative point of view than the federal government. But whenever, any time they're not, they're against states' rights. Period.
Right.
The one difference is that conservatives sometimes claim to be for states' rights, and basically liberals never really claim to be on principle for one or the other.
Right, although I think that's changing a little bit.
Right, yeah, you're starting to see the states' rights argument among liberals, but I think it's completely disingenuous.
I mean, you don't call it states' rights. States' rights puts it in a certain category.
Right.
It's a right. Don't mess with us.
Right.
I don't think we have a states' rights approach, but we certainly have a view of federalism as a good structure to organize a government, and that having a strong overarching federal government that creates solutions for the whole country is not necessarily what we not always the best way to solve problems.
Right.
That seems like a banal insight, but I think it would be a little. There was a time when it wasn't so banal.
No, that's right. And I mean, I think it's telling the fact that conservatives' interest in what you would call the principle of states' rights pretty much disappeared with the end of Jim Crow. So you can say it was a fine principle and one that was distorted with this one regrettable instance, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is, everyone, once you didn't have Jim Crow anymore, pretty much all conservatives stopped caring about states' rights, and you were left with a tiny remnant of academics at small libertarian conferences who cared about it. So I think that shows that for most people who were interested in states' rights, it was just a cover for supporting Jim Crow.
Right. Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, I lived through the welfare reform fights of the 90s, and that was mostly a lot of it was about making people work. But the other side of it was, just give this state this block of money. They know best. Washington shouldn't tell them what to do. Which, in a sense, was that's always appealing rhetoric, and it was just rhetoric because, in fact, states always designed their own welfare programs, and they had, radically different benefits and all kinds of things. There's a little mythology about it, but I mean, it's always been a powerful bit of rhetoric for a bunch of reasons, and I think that's partly because of that sense that states are closer to the problems and the federal government is this big distant entity.
Right. Right.
But I think they can use it also to sort of break systems by creating systems where there's no clarity about where responsibility is. It at the state? Is it the federal level? Who do you go to? And before you know it, the system's broken, and all you know is government stinks. As they kind of shift the responsibility back and forth.
Agreed. See, are we getting too boring by agreeing too much?
By what?
Are we getting too boring by agreeing too much now? Are we falling into the trap you
Well,
discussed?
let's find something we disagree on.
I should say that earlier I was making some obscene Italian hand gestures.
Good,
that,
great.
That you could not see.
I will look forward to. Well, first rule of Bloggingheads TV is never watch your own Bloggingheads TV.
Right. Well, you might want to watch that part.
Okay, good. Well, good for you. I'll top that.
All right.
At some point, you won't know when it's coming, but
They'll be mooning the camera by the third
right.
second.
Okay. I don't think that's allowed because of the whiteness settings on the cameras or whatever. So, do you want to? One of the big issues in that argument between Ann Althouse and Jonah Goldberg had to do with libertarians and their role in conservatism. And
right.
You've written some interesting remarks about Brink Lindsay from the Cato Institute in the article that he wrote in your fine publication, calling
yes.
for kind of an alliance between liberals and libertarians, which I thought was one of the most provocative and interesting things.
I thought so too, and
in the last few months.
And I very rudely sort of gave him the back of my hand, which I regret. I don't regret what I wrote, but I regret the fact that he wrote this nice outreach kind of thing, and I sort of said, "Screw off, buddy." I regret that I had to do that, but nonetheless, I felt it had to be said, so I said it.
Yeah. Well, let's remind people what you wrote and what the aspects of his argument you disagreed with were.
Well, his argument was that it was a pretty complex argument. It was a very subtle one, I think. Was that the liberal conservative fusionist alliance has broken down and failed, especially under the presidency of George W. Bush, and that even if you look historically, that most of the great libertarian, certainly no, what he said was the great liberal triumphs of the past 50 years or so have been in the social realm and have been libertarian ones as well. And he argued that there's a sort of natural political and philosophical alliance between libertarians and liberals. That philosophically, the free market is the most liberalizing force in American society and promotes social change. And that politically, libertarians were an important swing group that had swung to Democrats recently, but Democrats would need to do more to win them over. And that, I thought, was by far the weakest part of his argument. But I think the other part of his argument was kind of comes apart if you poke at it a little more closely as well.
Right. Well, that doesn't capture the fullness of your disagreement with him.
No, that's right.
You essentially thought he was sort of coming with an offer, and it was a bad deal. It was like, we give up Social Security and Medicare,
right.
and in exchange we get
right.
something.
He proposed a few areas of where we would come together, and it was sort of, okay, we'll get rid of most of the social functions of the government, but I'm not sure what the exchange was. We'll keep some of the spending for the poor.
Right. Well, I thought there were a number of interesting things about it. Obviously it's true. There is no functioning libertarian party, which has always actually been a great mystery to me about American politics. I think very few people find that as interesting a mystery as I do.
That's right. I'm one of them who finds it less interesting than you do.
What'd you say?
I'm one of those people who finds it less interesting than you do.
Yeah, maybe it's sort of obvious. You're around libertarians for a while. You realize, okay, there's gun libertarians, there's hard money libertarians, there's drug libertarians, there's
right.
porno libertarians. They really don't have that much in common.
And there just aren't very many of them. There's just very, very, very few libertarians in this country.
There are very few pure libertarians, exactly.
Yeah, even vague libertarians, there aren't that many. They're just overrepresented in, in the upper crust, basically.
Right. Except how millions of people identify themselves at one point or another as kind of a libertarian.
Right.
Marcos Moulitsas Zuniga identified himself as a libertarian in his little manifesto about liberalism. Marcos from Daily Kos.
Right.
And I think
Jon Stewart on the Daily Show did so recently as well.
Who did? Jon Stewart. Yeah. It's kind of like if you don't have my view of it is if you don't have a little bit of libertarian in you, there's something wrong with you.
Right. I think mostly those are people who don't understand what libertarianism is, and they're not libertarians at all. They just
if you take a cold bath in pure libertarianism, it's horrifying. It's not a world you could want to live in.
Right.
But there's that element of it that I think that always has truth to it. there's always, I've done a lot of work on campaign finance reform, for example, and after a while I can realize, you know what, the libertarian critique of regulating money in politics has a lot to it. There's a lot to it. We need to respect that. So without calling myself a libertarian by any means, I always think I'm sort of drawn to the idea that there are some truths there that maybe we can bind to liberalism. And I thought there were some interesting specific thoughts in his article. For example, the way he talks, and a lot of, even people in the Bush administration talk about this, like their thing about health care is there's an aspect of this which is real insurance, which is real shared risk, and we should protect that and keep it what it is. And the rest we need to deal with in some different way, where you kind of give people money to pay for the things they need or things like that. I'm not going to go in that direction, but I think there's an interesting clarity in trying to... I like the fact that he at least respected that there is a strong role for social insurance to protect people against, the vicissitudes of life.
So what you're saying is he was interesting to the extent that he was non-libertarian.
Well, maybe to the extent that he was not libertarian, I thought it was interesting. But which is to say that it's not really fair to say that he didn't offer anything. I mean, he was kind of trying to meet liberalism halfway, or somewhat of the way.
Yeah.
Who defines the halfway?
Right. No, that's right. I mean, politically is where it really, really gets weak.
Right.
You just have so many more populists than libertarians, and anything you do to win libertarians.
Yeah. Populist is in some ways a more troubling word to me than libertarian.
It's an abused word, but I'm using in the classic sense of like that chart of ideological beliefs where you have populist in one corner and libertarian in the other corner. So populist meaning anti-libertarian, people who are sort of social traditionalists and for big government.
Right. I mean, I sort of feel like in the last year, two really interesting options for a kind of next phase of American politics and potentially a bipartisan, potentially a phase that has some alliances in it, let's say, have been offered. And one is Lindsay's libertarian approach, and the other is, Ross Douthat, who's done a lot of Bloggingheads, and Rehan Salam, their article called The Party of Sam's Club, which came out about a year ago. Yeah. And what they're proposing is essentially an alliance between social conservatives and liberals around the idea that what you need is a strong supportive government if what you care about is families.
Right.
And I find both of those, interesting and provocative, and assuming that, liberals can't, take control of the presidency and throw the bums out and run the country unilaterally, which is actually a scary proposition. In fact, not as scary as the alternative, but I sort of worry about that overkill. Assuming that some alliances will have to be found, and you have a choice between those two, they're both interesting. I mean, there are significant downsides to the alliance with socially conservative populists, let's say, even if it does give you an opening to really rethink about a strong, supportive big government. Big government isn't the only thing that liberalism stands for.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I don't even think liberalism stands for big government as any kind of principle.
No.
I would think liberalism means being open or just agnostic about the size of government.
Right. It means being active in trying to solve public problems.
Right. However you do it.
However you do it, and I thought in some ways Lindsay had the glimmers of some ideas about how you might try to solve public problems, and that was. I mean, I don't agree with them all, but
going that way in the sort of the Ross Douthat and Rehan Salam way are essentially mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
And I'm a big. I'd much prefer the Ross Douthat Rehan Salam way.
Yeah.
I just think first of all, politically it makes far more sense. The libertarian, the Brink Lindsay way is just a path to total political suicide, and I'm not in favor of that. But just philosophically, I think it makes far more sense to look at the ways in which rampant inequality and economic insecurity have been bad for traditional family life. which is a thing that Ross and Ryan. Now, I don't agree with all their solutions, but that's a problem that they're focusing on and trying to get conservatives, I think, with very little success to recognize. And over time, I think they'll realize that they're going to have no success at all getting conservatives to focus on that, and they either have to decide whether they want to be support the Republican Party in any way, or just give up on the whole idea. I don't know what they'll do.
Right. Except there are going to be some irreconcilables in a alliance with social conservatives, right? I mean that's going to require people who are pro-life and anti-gay marriage or anti-gay rights to live in a party that is basic where those issues are resolved,
right?
Or to live in a coalition in which those issues are considered basically resolved.
It's true.
Some people can do it. Obviously, Bob Casey can do it. But Harry Reid can do it. But
they're not anti-gay rights.
For some people, that's going to be a harder thing to do. There are fewer irreconcilables, I think, in the once you're compromising your libertarianism, there are fewer irreconcilables other than kind of the commitments we all share to to freedom of speech and freedom of association and so forth.
See, to me, it's less dire than that with the moderate social conservatives. I don't think any of them, I don't think any potential Democrats or potential people who would be involved with liberals are anti-gay rights. Ross Douthat and Ryan Salam are not anti-gay rights. Bob Casey's not. A lot of what we call the social conservatives are not anti-gay rights, and I think that's a really important principle for liberals that you really can't compromise on. Maybe you could say maybe not gay marriage, but civil unions, and put off gay marriage for a while. On abortion, well, that's a whole other can of worms. But I basically buy their argument that Roe v. Wade is just bad law. It's just a bad ruling, and you can be for abortion rights, but don't think it's in the Constitution. In the same way that I'm for universal health care, but I don't think the Constitution requires that either.
I'm certainly hearing you right now.
Right. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sort of willing to throw Roe v. Wade off over the side and fight for abortion rights at the state level and at the national level. In law, I'd probably end up with some kind of compromise that's a little bit more restrictive than what we have now, but not draconian.
But not everywhere would it be. I mean, some places it would be draconian, and there you get back to the states' rights issue.
Right.
Are you willing to accept that
as I said,
there are 5 states in which it would be absolutely draconian?
Right.
Or just accept it's a bad ruling, but it's the ruling, so we're just gonna live with it, which was kind of the Souter position,
right,
in the Casey decision.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a reasonable decision. It's a bad decision, but one that's already been in place for so long we can't change it.
Right.
I don't think it's a persuasive argument, but it's not wildly unreasonable.
Right.
I don't think I'd be very happy about that kind of logic with, another ruling that I found abhorrent. Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, that was in place for a long time.
But it was but I mean, the fundamental result of it was immoral.
Right.
If you argue the fundamental result of Roe v. Wade was to my liking,
right,
as a judicial argument, it leaves something to be desired, which is,
it leaves a lot to be desired. You should make judicial arguments that
liberal
way.
argument.
Right.
It's a Lawrence Tribe argument. It's to some extent Justice Ginsburg's argument. That's not a crazy thing to say.
It's not a crazy thing to say, but I think it's an inappropriate way to make law.
Yeah. But you're not going to find an alliance. You're not going to create an alliance between people who think abortion is an absolute moral crime that they would like to see outlawed by an amendment to the Constitution.
Right.
You're not going to create an alliance between those people and people who think Roe v. Wade was kind of decided in a bad way.
But I think you can, though, because they can say, look, we're not going to get that constitutional amendment anytime soon. But if the law chipped away at Roe versus Wade and made it more of a political issue and less of one that had been decided by fiat in the Supreme Court, that would be a result that we could live with.
Right.
So yeah, I think there is some room for compromise there.
Yeah. Well, that would require breaking down the politics on the right that's always dangling. We'll get you that constitutional amendment. We'll do the constitutional amendment on gay marriage. We'll do the constitutional amendment on abortion. It's always dangling that possibility in front of them. Even though it's obviously it's
always going to be out of reach, and they have no intention of acting on it at all. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think some social conservatives have figured that out.
Right.
A little bit. It's starting to dawn on them that they've been victims of a shell game for what, 25 years now.
Yeah. But it keeps going on.
Yeah.
And the libertarians think they've been victims of a shell game.
Which, to some extent, they have also.
It's all a shell game.
Right. Well,
it really has been an amazing. I mean, that's a big part of this whole thing is the degree to which they've been willing to operate politics as a shell game.
Right.
And never actually, deliver the things that they would have to deliver that have consequences.
Right. Well, this is the main topic of my book. Can I plug my book, even though it's not coming out for 10 months, just to explain a little bit about? I mean, what it's about is basically like, very few Republicans are actually getting what they want. The only two groups within the Republican Party who actually get what they want are supply-siders and business lobbyists.
Right.
But they're a very, very small percentage of the party as a voting base.
Right.
But they're basically the ones who are calling all the shots. And the libertarians aren't getting what they want. The social conservatives aren't getting what they want. The moderates aren't getting what they want.
Right.
Almost nobody's getting what they want. So it's a very perverse result, which is what I'm trying to explain how this has managed to go on for so long.
Well, that sounds great. Why not put your book in, make your book open source so people can read it now?
If I understood what that meant, I would
people, make it put it in the public domain so that it serves knowledge.
Okay.
We're all looking forward to it. I think the other question is what business is getting any good for business? You know what?
Right.
When you look at, I did a column about this a couple months ago, looking at there are all these business decided in the last two elections to actually encourage people to vote and register their employees and get them to vote in what they term what's in the interests of their companies. And there are all these, basically the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers and Business Industry Pact will put together a website for your company's employees so they understand what's important. And it's not partisan, but it says, what's important to our company is getting rid of the death tax and more oil exploration and all these things. You will never find on one of those websites what matters to the future of our company is doing something about healthcare.
Right.
You'll never find that in a million years. So some narrow category of short-term investors is getting a good deal out of this. But I don't think business is getting a good deal at the moment.
No, that's right. I mean, and that's actually, if I can get back to my book, this is part of what I'm writing about also, how business has become completely realigned in its political interests from 30, 40, 50 years ago when they had some sense of the public good. Sort of the old, what's good for GM is good for America. What's good for America is good for GM idea. To just seeing Washington as a kind of slot machine. You put in $100,000 in contributions for the Republican Party, you will get back $250 million in tax breaks the next time they sit down to write a trade bill.
That's right.
And it's just a direct profit center. It's just a cash machine basically.
Right.
The Washington lobby shops have become a profit center, and that's the only lens in which most of these businesses can view it anymore.
That's right.
It's just what we can add to our bottom line next year. Period.
Right. And it's a pretty good deal, in fact. I mean, throw $5 million into your Washington office, a couple $1 million of campaign contributions, and you get some, depreciation tax break. Some scam might be worth, 30, 50 million.
Yep.
Sorry, there are too many. It's still a relatively cheap game.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The rate of return is astronomical, which is exactly why lobbying has exploded over the past 5 years. The number of lobbyists in Washington has doubled during the Bush presidency. It's more than doubled.
Right.
The pay for lobbyists has almost doubled in many of these areas because you just, again, book. You'll have to read the book to get the full story here, but that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is that the deal is so good, everyone's getting in. It's a sort of gold rush. You can't get this rate of return in any other venue where you can get back 10, 20, 100 times what you put in.
Right.
Because the federal government deals in very, very, very large numbers, and so $10, $20, $100,000 in contributions and expenditures is just nothing compared to what you can get out of it.
Well, you can also create an entire company out of lobbying, and that's part of the story, I think, of some of the Iraq contracting and of the Duke Cunningham scandal and so forth. And if you have the people in the right positions under the really, and this required that. This is the corruption that we can eliminate. But You could go in and you could have nothing, and you could say, I'm going to get the contract to, digitize all the documents in Iraq or something like that. You may know nothing about that business.
Right.
But you get that contract, you've got it, that's your business, you've got that business. And I don't even know, I have no idea whether they even do it at all.
Right. Right.
But it's an amazing, it's a terrible racket. How did we get on that?
Yeah, I was trying to think about how we got to that.
Yeah.
It was a few steps.
I don't know. Well, I think it will change. I got an email today that says, tomorrow begins today, which is,
From John Edwards.
or starts today, which is John
Right.
Edwards'
That was the title of a
slogan.
Bond flick also.
It's good title for a Bond flick. I think over on the American Prospect website, over on Tapped, Garance Franca Ruta had, either an amazing show of erudition or an amazing display of good Googling. She had 5 or 6 examples of other people who've used exactly that slogan, tomorrow begins today, or tomorrow starts today. One of them being Comandante Marcos of the Zapatista militia in Mexico. So,
Yeah. Well, so are you suggesting that Edwards is going to move his campaign in more of a militia-oriented direction?
no, but I mean, no.
Yeah. I
don't think we're ready for real. I don't think John Edwards is the voice of real radicalism.
Right. And the Republicans have all the guns.
Right.
I've been hoping that George Allen would do that in the recount, just refuse to accept the legitimacy and flee to the hills of Virginia.
I actually have more faith putting a gun in John Edwards' hands than George Allen's hands. I'd run away if you saw a gun in George Allen's hands.
Yeah, that's what George Allen really wants to do, though.
Yeah.
I think that there's been this whole comical frou-frou about Edwards and the fact that he scooped himself by, his campaign announced that he was running, so now there's no news value. And journalists are really hung up on this, news value idea. I mean, you saw this.
Right.
You saw this. I remember in 2004 when Kerry basically was looking, saying, like, look, there's a loophole in campaign finance that basically puts me at an enormous disadvantage by having my campaign earlier than George W. Bush. So what if I formally don't accept the nomination, and for another couple months I can put myself on equal footing terrain, and I'll just have the convention without formally accepting it. The network said, well, no, there's no news anymore if you don't accept the nomination, so we're not going to cover it, which is crazy. The point of a convention isn't to break a news story, and if it was, you would cover it for 10 minutes and say, all right, he accepted the nomination, now we know who he is, back to regularly scheduled programming. The idea is the news takes the time to look at, give the public a window into the candidate and what the candidate believes. It's the same thing with the presidential announcement speech. So you're saying, well, it's no longer news. We know Edwards running. Well, of course we know Edwards is running. We've known that for 2 years. That's not the point. Isn't to cover the news story.
Right.
That now spit out your cereal. John Edwards is running for president. Everyone, that's sort of the convention. Everyone has to run a front page story about John Edwards and what he wants to do and who he is. This is how you educate the public. And these events are just hooks. So there's been this bizarre journalistic focus on the news value and does it diminish the coverage he gets, which is just, I just think, incredibly stupid.
I guess that's probably right. But it's that sort of weird dance that the media always has to do between doing the analysis that it wants to do, that it has to do, but
Right.
still the belief that everything comes from an objective source of information, an objective thing.
Right.
So there is an event that triggers. You can't just choose, okay, today's the day when we're all going to write about John Edwards and what he stands for.
Right.
You have to have that. You have to have that news peg, otherwise you're not being a journalist. You're engaging in whatever it is that bloggers do.
No, you can. I mean, it doesn't have to be opiniony. You can say that now he's giving his speech, telling everyone who's running for president, and you just say, like, here's what his platform is. Here are the pros and cons of his candidacy. Here's his chances of winning. Blah 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 blah. Whatever it is you do it that day. You have to do it. Otherwise, the alternative is to sort of never do it because everyone knows these guys are running for president anyway. But you should never do it.
Right. Well, and of course, it's also. I mean, we've had the 3 weeks of Obama mania without any precipitating event.
Right.
A book tour and a couple of, the dropping out of some other candidates. So they didn't exactly need to wait for that announcement. I think you and I probably, I don't know. Do you watch the evening news?
No. Never.
Yeah, I haven't watched the evening news in years and years. I think that the point of the announcement is, I think we're probably too much print people or online people or whatever. I mean, the point of the announcement is that is the day when you will be the lead or the second story on the evening news.
Right.
And you only get that once or twice in a presidential campaign.
Right.
And you got to get that. I mean, obviously, the Gerald Ford story will probably be the, I don't know if that's the lead tonight, whatever, maybe I should watch to find out what actually becomes the lead.
You let me know what they say.
Yeah, we'll let you know what we'll decide what they say, but that steps on Edwards more than his own misstep did.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And the same thing happened to him in 2004, right? Well, Wes Clark decided he was going to get in, right? Right when Edwards was announcing he got.
Oh yeah, I remember that. That's always my big dilemma. I was an Edwards guy, and then I got distracted by Wes Clark, and then at the end I came back to Edwards. So
yeah.
Try to.
I don't think it was a distraction.
Yeah, it was unfortunately a distraction. He was Clark was has a huge potential.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah.
I mean, do you believe the theory that the field is basically cleared at this point, and it's Senator Clinton and Obama and maybe an Edwards kind of to the side, or
probably
do you think it's more open? Yeah,
probably. But I've been wrong about this before. I was so certain that John Kerry was dead in 2004.
Right.
2003, 2004. I do think the fact that he won the nomination, I think I've talked about this before, was one of the great flukes of history. Just this incredible confluence of events, just like the classic. It was the classic mantra of the candidate who's at 3% of the polls. Like, what if the following 6 things happen? Like the 2 leading candidates, take each other out, and then so-and-so stumbles, and then there's a bus crash, and then, I do this right at this moment. That's sort of what it actually happened, like the Dick Lugar fantasy of all the candidates who actually came true for John Kerry.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, I think Kerry's somebody that you can look at him out of one side of your eye, and he looks absolutely ridiculous, and you can't imagine how did that guy ever get elected, lieutenant governor, much less anything else. And then you can look at him another way and just see a very different figure. And I think a lot of us did see. I thought I thought his campaign was finished too, and he was not hardly my first, second, or third choice, but my first, second, or third choice never wins the nomination.
Right.
So I guess in 2000 my second choice did.
I never looked at him that other way. I was just looking like, are you people crazy? You want to nominate this guy?
Yeah. Well, you brought down Dean, so you're responsible.
I know. I single-handedly brought down Dean.
You single-handedly brought down Dean.
I know. And all my candidates finished as also rants.
Right.
What should we do next? Gerald Ford, Iraq.
You want to
Gerald Ford and Iraq?
Gerald Ford. Let's talk about Ford, Vietnam, and then maybe about Iraq.
Sure.
In that order. What do you have to say about Gerald Ford?
He was the last moderate Republican president. He was the last president who governed from that party before. I think the far right took the party over, perhaps irrevocably. As everyone says, he was a very, very decent man. He was a University of Michigan alumnus and a big fan of University of Michigan football, which appeals to me as being both those. Although,
all right, this is on the verge of being the most boring blogging heads ever. Let's get going on the guy. You defend him or attack him.
Defend him or attack him. I'm against the assassination of Gerald Ford. Why are you for it? Why are you defending it? What kind of man are you?
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously, I think that's right, and I think it's interesting how kindly he has been received,
right,
in the columns and so forth. I mean, some of it sort of ridiculous. I mean, David Broder's column saluting all the great people in the Ford administration, when there were some perfectly great people like Edward Levy, I suppose, who was the Attorney General, and brought us John Paul Stevens and so forth. But there was also Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. One of the people that Broder names as a great veteran of the Ford administration was L. Paul Bremer, Jerry Bremer, the guy who probably is the most single-handedly responsible for everything that's gone wrong in Iraq.
Oh, I disagree. I'd say Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld is far worse.
Well, Rumsfeld, yeah. Okay. I mean, on the ground decisions. Whatever. That's one of those that historians will be debating for many years. What's interesting is there hasn't been I just read the 2 obituaries. There hasn't been much of coverage of what I think is the story. I mean, there's not too much that I'm too young to remember, but I don't really remember any of this very well. I think the fundamental story of the Ford campaign in 1976 was, after Rumsfeld and Cheney took over, and then he makes Rumsfeld he kicks out Schlesinger, makes Rumsfeld Secretary of Defense. Cheney becomes Chief of Staff, and then they do the pardon, and then Ford cuts really hard to the right, and he has the Reagan challenge, and he cuts really hard to the right, and then he's 25 points down against Carter, and then he turns around and he kind of sidelines Cheney, who's basically sunk him, sidelines Cheney, brings in the sort of moderate political consultants like this guy John Deardorff, who'd been, I think, a Rockefeller consultant, and kind of works his way back to the point that I think it's commonly thought that if there was another week in '76, Ford would have won that election. If he'd sidelined Cheney earlier and returned to the kind of moderate thing, he would have won that election. That's an interesting but I didn't see any of that discussion in the obituaries, which seems to be profoundly relevant right now.
Yeah, and actually, if I can scoop myself slightly,
you said you wouldn't do that. I don't want to be a party to that.
Well, let me do more self promotion and just drop a little tantalizing hint, which is that my plan for my LA Times column. And I have another 5 or 6 hours still to do, so that can always change. But was to write about what would have happened if Ford had won in '76, and would that have been better for American politics, American liberalism? I think it would have. In fact, if that had happened, or if Reagan had managed to take the nomination from him in '76, and both of those things were extremely close to happening. The only really awful outcome, I think, was that Ford wins the nomination from Reagan and then loses the general election to Carter. If any other outcome had happened, I think the country would have ended up being a better place. But you'll have to read the LA Times on Sunday to find out why.
Okay, LA Times on Sunday. Make everybody, fortunately, not behind any kind of LA Times select wall or anything like that.
It's free and open to everyone.
So
come on by.
So it can be read, but that's probably all there is to say about Gerald Ford. Except, I mean, it's also, I think we sort of forget. I always think of Nixon as presiding over the end of the Vietnam War, but it was really in the Ford administration that the evacuation from Saigon and everything took place.
Right.
And I've been thinking about this recently. Not just what's happening in Iraq, but what the concept. I don't feel we've really come to grips with what it means to lose a war. What it means to invade a country and essentially lose.
Right.
In one form or another have to leave. I went to college with a guy, was one of these, campus conservatives. He's the kind of guy I always think, when I think about what George Bush was like in college, I think of this guy. And this guy used to go around and he'd pump his fist and he'd say, America's great. We're 5-1 in major wars. It was sort of one of his little slogan. Which was actually kind of ironic because the one was not that long before. I mean, it was only a decade or so earlier.
Right.
But this was the high tide of Reaganism, and this was when it was cool on campus to be a conservative. But it's really, I mean, the consequences of that loss, all really shaped the whole Carter years, the Reagan years. I mean, it obviously shaped our military for many, many years. And I don't think we've begun to think about what it's going to mean.
Right.
As a country, to come out of this. I mean, the things that I don't have answers
to. It's only
to this.
starting to happen. Right.
Putting it on the table, but it's there. It's a presence in front of our eyes. I just don't feel like we've begun to.
It's only starting to
that.
happen. Yeah, it's starting to happen. It's you're starting to see the reverberations in both parties, especially the Democratic Party. And I think it'll continue and get. From my perspective, worse. You always overreact to the last event, and probably we're all guilty of that. You and I were, certainly I was pretty influenced by the Gulf War, when you had 80% of the Democrats in the Senate voting no, and everyone saying. All I remember is the evening news, and you'd open up Time and Newsweek, and they were talking about World War I style trench warfare with these. I remember reading these graphics in Time or Newsweek with these oil-filled trenches that would be lit on fire, and there were remember the 30,000 body bags you couldn't.
Oh yeah.
The nation was it 90,000 or 60,000 is a very,
Right.
very large number. So, and this became a sort of fact that we were going to have that many dead soldiers for sure,
Right.
minimum, because the Pentagon would obviously be underestimating the number of dead. So if they have 60,000 body bags or whatever, it's obviously going to be at least that. And they were all wrong. They were all horribly, horribly wrong about this.
Right.
And we all, I think, overinterpreted this lesson. And I think you'll have people starting to overinterpret what happens in Iraq in the opposite way. In part because I think you've got a lot of people online who are very, very young, and this is the only war they remember. So not only is it an intense experience, it's the formative one. It's the only one. So they, you sort of see this line that the people who are wrong about Iraq should basically never be listened to about foreign affairs again. But of course, there were a lot of people on the left who are wrong about the first Gulf War. I would say much more wrong. And the idea, and this is sort of how we got into the mess in the first place, because a lot of us thought, well, we should never listen to those people again. But some of what they had to say was prescient.
Right. Well, I'm a little sympathetic to the idea that we seem to have sort of an unchanged view of who are the people one should listen to, who are the wise, responsible, sensible, realistic people on foreign policy, and they're still the same people who are wrong about the war. I'm not sure I see it in quite that light. I mean, I was, the first Gulf War was when I was first working on the Hill, working for Bill Bradley, and I drafted his speeches in opposition, and I would hang out with the guy who worked on the Intelligence Committee who would sort of paint the same picture, and Sam Nunn was against the first Gulf War and so
Right.
forth, and we knew those scenarios. There were also, they were things that had a chance of happening. And you had to weigh,
Right.
if you say there's a 40% chance of this consequence, is it worth it for Kuwait? You might read that a certain way. And there's still a 60% chance that we march in and win. And then there was still, as it turned out, long-term consequences. There's this new theory of, this is a 30-year war or something like that, that it was basically, that the first and second wars are basically, are basically the same fight.
Which
we
I agree
didn't
with.
actually win the first Gulf War. I'm not sure I totally believe that. Obviously you could have gone with sanctions for a long time, and at some point Saddam would have fallen.
I don't think that's true at all. And that was the big liberal argument, that if we just stick with sanctions long enough, he'll quit Kuwait. Well, I think the years that happened and followed after the Gulf War pretty much disabused everyone of that notion. Saddam Hussein was not going to give up Kuwait. He wouldn't give up his non-existent weapons of mass destruction in order to, alleviate sanctions. He wouldn't give up something that didn't exist.
You mean in 2003?
Well, right, in the years after, right,
Yeah.
throughout the whole '90s, and then leading up to 2003, there were heavy sanctions in Iraq, which were costing lots of money. Obviously, they were hurting ordinary Iraqis, but even his own elite was being denied the chance to enrich themselves and build more palaces and terrify their neighbors with conventional weapons and whatnot. They wouldn't do it because he wanted to protect his non-existent weapons of mass destruction program. I think that the idea, which was extremely common among Democrats and liberals in the first Gulf War, that sanctions would have worked, is totally fanciful. And again, what I would also say is that a lot of
sanctions and inspections. Once you have the inspectors back in, you just don't,
right, but that was there were no inspectors in 1990. It was just sanctions. That was the argument.
That's right.
Was that it was just sanctions alone would do it.
No, I don't know.
Go ahead.
I don't know the consequences of replaying history to say if we hadn't had the first Gulf War. I don't necessarily want to replay that. You could certainly replay if we hadn't had the second, and the consequences of the second, I think, were a lot easier to see.
Sure.
It was what Colin Powell called the pottery barn rule. You go, you break it, you own it. It's your. You need to know what you're going to be able to, what you're going to do with that country, if you choose to go to Baghdad and engage in regime change.
Well, sure, but the difference here is that the Doves were wrong in 1990, but we never had to live with the consequences of that wrongness, and the Hawks were wrong in 2003, but we did have to live with the consequences of it. So you can say, well, here's the real repercussions of one mistake and the hypothetical repercussions of another, but that doesn't mean that one side was more wrong than the other just because one set of repercussions has happened and the other didn't.
Right. Well, I guess That may be, but it's different people, it's different circumstances. I don't think that the fact that some, not even doves, people like Sam Nunn, the fact that some people were wrong about the first Gulf War doesn't excuse the profound wrongness. And I'm not picking on you because you were certainly quicker than others to adjust to reality. And it was a hard call. It wasn't an easy call. It wasn't an easy call, I think, for anybody. But the profound wrongness about the second has to have some consequences for people. I mean, what is especially the kind of Ken Pollack sort of foreign policy elite circles. I mean, it has to in the end somehow reshape what we think are the elite circles and who we think are the people who should be listened to. I mean, being right has a huge payoff.
It does.
If you're George Kennan or somebody like that, being wrong ought to have some consequences too.
Yeah, it's weird. I like Ken Pollack a lot. I think he's to me, he's just about the smartest foreign policy analyst, or one of them there is on the left of center. So,
I don't know.
I think there were a lot of things that he didn't know and couldn't have known, and so I'm much more cautious about punishing people for being wrong about something that you couldn't possibly know. I think Ohio State is going to beat Florida badly in the BCS championship game. But of course, if in this moment right now, Troy Smith is choking to death on a pretzel in his hotel room, then Ohio State's probably not going to win. But that doesn't mean that my prediction is crazy.
Well, true, but you are not you are not at the Ken Pollack level of actually playing in the environment that made it very difficult for liberals to oppose the war. It's like if your prediction about a football game is irrelevant. You're just a spectator. If you're the coach and you don't have a backup prepared for that quarterback or whoever. I don't know.
We need to stop this analogy right now.
You're talking about other sports, but not college football. If you don't have a backup prepared, if you haven't done those things, and you lose the game for that reason, and you do it again, and that's your pattern, you will lose your job.
Right, but yeah, I don't think there's a pattern there. Basically, there are a lot of things that people didn't know were going to happen in Iraq, and one of them was no one knew there weren't weapons of mass destruction, and there's been a sort of revisionism here about that. Well, we believe the Bush administration, blah blah blah. I mean, I didn't believe the Bush administration, and I knew that they were trying to make the case easier than it was. They gilded the lily. They made it seem more dire and more imminent than it actually was. But I just basically made a rule. Okay, I'm not going to believe anything that only comes from them, but things that come from other sources, and there was a lot to believe that there was an active, thriving weapons of mass destruction program in Iraq. Everyone really was fooled on that. Let me go off on a slight tangent here, because I think there's this weird conflation that people on both sides need to make. And that's between believing that everyone was surprised and believing that Bush didn't lie about it. And people want to, both those things can be true. Conservatives say, Bush didn't lie about weapons of mass destruction. Everyone was wrong. Everyone was shocked. Well, no. Everyone was wrong. But in addition to things that everyone believed to be true, Bush also and his administration made up a lot of things that everyone didn't know to be true. And liberals make the same mistake. They say, well, no, everyone did. You can't. Everyone knew that this was all a lie. It was just, all there was Bush just making the whole thing up, and that's not really true either.
I think there was a lot of reason to believe by the eve of the invasion that if there was something that you might be able to label WMD, like, a tank of some, chemical that might be the same chemical under your kitchen sink, even if there was something you could label WMD, it was no kind of actual threat. It was no kind of actual threat. And I think there was a lot of reason to think that. And if you thought there was a 50% chance of that, I think that to push through with the invasion at that point was insane. And I think there were plenty of liberals who understood that. I mean, I remember a column by Bill Arkin in the Washington Post. Who's really a very respected military observer, who said, you know what? As far as I can tell, the U.S. military is not actually concerned about being attacked by weapons of mass destruction. They just don't think that's actually a concern for them. If there is anything, it's, old mustard gas and they've got their gas masks and it's no problem. Well, at that point, what do you have?
No, that wasn't it. It was the fact that Saddam Hussein was trying to obtain a nuclear weapon, which is something we just had to stop. And you had to stop that sometime.
Well, but lots of people are trying to obtain nuclear weapons, and some of them, we obviously don't stop all of them by military means. The way to stop people from obtaining nuclear weapons is to stop them from getting, nuclear stuff. And we didn't really have any reason to believe he was anywhere on the path.
Well, we did have reason to believe it, though. I mean, I don't have the exact numbers. What was it, like German and French military intelligence?
Which was the aluminum tubes, which was the lie.
No,
that was the lie. So it was the lie.
This was not the aluminum tubes. German and French intelligence, before the whole aluminum tube that came out, thought that Saddam Hussein was, 2 to 3 years away from obtaining a nuclear weapon? To me, that was a very powerful piece of evidence. Now, it turned out they were wrong. But
Right.
That's what they believed, and that estimate was out there and it was published. To me, it was highly persuasive. I mean, that means you had some unknown period of time, but not a very, very long time, to stop him from obtaining that weapon.
Right. But the
Now,
U.S.
again,
government didn't actually make that. The U.S. government didn't make a 2 to 3 year estimate, right? Even in the National Intelligence Estimate.
What was the U.S. government's estimate? I thought we didn't know.
I don't remember. I'm sure it wasn't 2 or 3 years.
We didn't know. And there was the previous experience, the Gulf War, where it turns out we thought, what was it? I mean, I don't remember. Again, the exact numbers aren't in my head right now, but before the war, we thought this number was something like 10 years away from a nuclear weapon, but then afterwards, what we learned was that it was much closer than that. And so, again, there was a previous experience here that again, I think I and a lot of people overinterpreted, of people just over-learning the lesson of the previous war, saying, well, hey, we thought it was X years, but it turned out to be, 1/2 of X years.
Right.
So, we think it'll be, but, 2, 3, 5 years, I don't remember what the number was, but maybe it's even less.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess, just to go back to the beginning, to the point of where we began this discussion, which is the consequences of losing a war, and obviously, to some extent, the military and the country kind of overlearned the lessons of the Vietnam War.
Right.
There was a bit of a backlash, and Cheney and Rumsfeld come out of that backlash. Mm-hmm. I mean, they come out of that period. And what's shocking to me is they don't realize it's, you need to use your power wisely if you want to avoid that kind of backlash.
Yep.
The same is true on executive power. You think that the Church Committee and some of the things in the 70s took away too much executive power in the backlash against Watergate and domestic wiretapping and so forth. Well, lesson number 1 ought to be, don't do that, because there will be a backlash.
Right.
I don't understand how people don't have that kind of understanding that people do overreact to lessons learned.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge error by the Hawks. I mean, it's one that I thought, especially like the sort of conservative ultra Hawks, didn't realize at all, and still don't realize exactly how much of a reaction there's going to be. And in their view, I think we're all in for some, sort of bad times foreign policy wise, but from the ultra Hawk perspective, some extremely bad times.
Yeah.
From their point of view, and I don't think they realize the extent to which they brought this on themselves.
Right.
And this is a case I was making about Bush's politicizing of the war. From the very beginning, he had no intention of broadening the coalition. His intention was to use foreign affairs as a partisan cudgel. Right. And you could see that in the short run that will help you. We won them in the 2002 elections, and probably won them in the 2004 elections. But in the long run, if you care about the ideas and not just the fortunes of the Republican Party, the ideas are really going to suffer if you don't get as broad as possible of a buy-in.
That's right.
That was a huge mistake they made, I think. I mean, a long-term mistake they made.
That's right. All right. Well, we're getting close to an hour here, and
all right.
Sounds like you have a column to finish, and
yes,
I got to go meet my family down at a museum downtown. So,
well, rub it in.
Yeah, I'm going to rub it in. Well, I wouldn't mind I'll trade places whenever they want a new columnist at the LA Times. I'll trade places with you.
And I'll spend more time with my family.
Okay, right, exactly.
You'll take my
nobody
job.
ever asks the people's family whether they want more time with the person.
Right.
Okay, we got some good disagreement in there.
All right.
I don't know why you're not on my side, John, but there you are.
All right. And I'll make some more obscene Italian hand gestures at you that you can watch.
Okay, I'm gonna cut this thing off though, so the audience can't see that.
All right.
There might be children watching.
Okay.
Take care. Happy New Year.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.